Hello and welcome to Film Study 100. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and this is the Week 1 lecture. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to the class, and I wanted to give you a quick overview of the class here at the beginning of our first lecture. We can just do this quickly. I want to talk a little bit about Canvas, a little bit about our textbook, our course syllabus, and I just want to give you guys a general idea of what to expect from the class. And then we'll spend the rest of this lecture talking about our Week 1 material. So we do have a couple of short readings for this week and also some short films to watch. So we'll talk more about those, and we'll just get up and running and get ready for the rest of the semester. So I'm excited to teach this class. This is actually the second time I've taught Film Study 100 here at GBC. So it's a fun class. It's an introductory class. It is important to keep that in mind. We are not striving to become experts in this particular subject matter. We are not going to become film scholars necessarily by the end of the semester. Maybe later on some of us will. But our goals here are a little bit more simple. We're just trying to get introduced to and familiar with a lot of important terms, concepts, and historical developments associated with motion pictures, movies, cinema, what we now think of as movies. The way I've really structured this class, it's very much about history. That might be fun for some, a little bit less for others, but we really are going to track the development of movies in the Western world, with most of our attention, most of our focus, of course, being on movies made in the U.S., but we have to pay attention to some things that are happening in other countries, particularly this week at the beginning of motion pictures at the end of the 19th century, because there were some important breakthroughs in France, in England, and other parts of Europe. So it wasn't just an American thing, it was happening in other places. And a lot of these breakthroughs or historical developments were kind of happening simultaneously in different places with different people, but sort of following a somewhat similar trajectory. So we're going to really start at the beginning, which I think might be interesting. It might be a little bit strange at times, because these early films that we're going to be watching through the first few weeks of the semester are likely to be unlike the films that we normally watch. We're starting with silent films. So you guys, maybe some of us have seen some silent films before, but that's not typically what we watch when we're looking for some entertainment, or when we are going to the movie theater or looking for something to watch at home. I don't think many modern humans still watch silent movies, but we're going to experience them just a little bit so we can better understand this early stage in movie history. And then we're going to sort of move through time. So again, we're starting at in the late 19th century with the very first movies, and we're going to move up through the 20th century. We're going to eventually get into sound. That gets introduced at the end of the 1920s. We're going to sort of follow this path throughout the 20th century. We're going to see a lot of different kinds of movies, and we're going to conclude pretty close to present day. We're going to make our way up to modern movies. So don't worry, if you're not loving the early films, you might enjoy some of the later stuff that we watch when we get a little bit more modern near the end of the semester. So we cover a lot of ground. We obviously can't do everything justice in just one semester, just watching usually one movie a week. But we'll do the best we can. And often in these lectures, I'll give you guys a lot of historical context, a lot of background information that will help you to better understand the movies that we watch and these historical developments in movies that we are tracking throughout the class. So a few quick things just as we get started. Our required textbook, you can see it here. It is rather large. You can find it used online. You do not have to buy a new copy. If you go through the GBC bookstore, those might be new, I'm not quite sure, but you can find used copies online. but I would like everybody to have a copy of the Oxford History of World Cinema. It's a big book. Don't worry, we are not reading all of it. We are reading several chapters. There's some great pictures. It's just a really nice reference guide, really. I don't expect you guys to read it page for page. We are not reading it cover to cover. We're not covering all the chapters. We're really probably reading less than half, actually. But it's a good thing to have. You can always use it if you need it. You can use it more, to look up terms. And if you're interested, you might want to check out a few additional chapters that I know that I'm not assigning, for the class. So that's our one required book. If you don't have it today at the beginning of week 1 as you're watching this lecture, not the end of the world. Try to get it by the end of week 1. And if you're having trouble, if the delivery is taking a long time, if you're still waiting by the end of week 1, you might want to reach out and talk to me. I might be able to provide PDF versions of our first week's reading. We're just checking out a couple of sections in chapter 1. I might be able to make those available for you guys if you need them, but after week 1, I'm just going to expect and assume that everybody has the book, unless, I'm told otherwise. The other big thing to remember, since this is an online class, obviously, is we're going to use Canvas quite a bit. So really, everything that you need will be found in the weekly modules in Canvas. So I assume most of you are familiar with Canvas. That is the online learning platform that we use here at GBC. If you've taken previous classes at GBC, you've almost certainly used Canvas. We use those for live classes, online classes, all of our classes. Now, if this is your first semester at GBC, no worries. Canvas is pretty user-friendly. It's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. But if you're having any issues, if you're having trouble logging in, you can let me know. I won't be able to fix that for you. I'm not a tech guy, but I can refer you to technology services at GBC. They might be able to help out. You can email them, call them. But hopefully we're already familiar and comfortable with Canvas, or at least we will be soon. So if you're watching this lecture, you might already be in the week 1 module in Canvas. But if you're not, maybe take a moment to go there and take a look, because I like to follow the same routine each week. So I kind of do the same thing at the beginning of each week. I'll post that week's module in Canvas. And within that weekly module, you'll find everything that you need for the week. So you'll find these lecture videos, you'll find the reading assignment for the week, you'll also find the weekly discussion post. We do have discussions every week where we can talk about the movies that we watch. So you'll find a link to that. You'll find the readings posted. The movie will be available. I'll usually be able to provide a link for you guys, so you can then go and access the film that we're watching. Okay, and then also you need to watch these lectures. You don't have to do everything at the very beginning of the week. I'll post everything at the beginning of the week, and then you have the entire week to get all of that work done. So for us, a week always begins first thing Monday morning when I publish that week's module. And then the week will end around midnight Sunday. That's when any written assignments will be due. So your discussion post will be due by midnight on Sunday, and when we have papers, other assignments, those will also be due by the end of the week. And that's really how we do things. I would expect everybody to sort of get everything done by the end of that week, and then first thing the next Monday morning, we start our next week. So that's our routine. I like to keep it pretty much the same throughout the semester. It might get a little bit different at the very end when we're writing final papers and we're wrapping up. But for the most part, I like to stay on schedule. So if you're falling behind, if you're having trouble accessing a film, if you're having problems of any kind, reach out. email me and let's talk. So email is the best mode of communication in a class like this. Another thing you can find in the week 1 module is our course syllabus. And I would like you guys to take a look at that. You don't have to read it word for word, but it might be good to save it. Keep it handy so you can look at it later. You'll find my name, my email. So if you need to get in touch with me, you can always email me using the address I've listed on the syllabus. Also, there's a detailed class schedule within the syllabus document. That's the most important part. I would like you guys to hang on to that. Keep it handy. So if you miss time, let's say you get sick later in the semester, or you have to go out of town, or something happens that maybe takes you away from class for a week or maybe 2 weeks, you can use that class schedule to keep up. I'm telling you everything that we're doing throughout the semester, all of the movies we're watching, all of the material that we're covering week by week, the readings from the book, everything's there. So even if you're, in a different country or in bed feeling poorly, you can still try to keep up as best you can. And also reach out to me. We can always work out extensions and give you the time that you need to get caught up. So keep the schedule. Even if you don't miss time, it's still good to know what's coming, what to expect, and you can find all the due dates, all of the assignments are in there. And also typical syllabus stuff, all of my policies. You can find a list of all of the assignments, point values, everything else that you need is in that document. So take a look and just kind of get acquainted with Canvas if you haven't used it before. If you have any questions, let me know. And one final note, just make sure that you know your GBC email, because from time to time I will send out class-wide emails, and I usually only have your GBC accounts. Now, if you email me using your personal Gmail account, or whatever, that's fine. I can always respond to you that way. But when I send out a class-wide email, that will always be through your GBC email. And all of you have a GBC account. So just make sure you can access it and make sure you check it pretty regularly. Not just for this class, really, but for all of your classes. Okay, so let's get started on some of our week 1 material. So we're taking a look at a few parts of chapter 1 today. You'll notice the way the book is organized. Again, it's very big. It's a reference book. So it's got a lot of stuff that we're not actually going to be assigning or reading, but a lot of these chapters are quite long. So within the chapter, there are different sections or articles. So I rarely assign the entire an entire chapter. I'm usually going to give you some particular sections or articles within the chapter that we're reading. So this week, we're looking at 2 sections in chapter 1. And they are the first 2 sections of the chapter. So the first one is called Origins and Survival. And then right after that, Early Cinema. So those are the 2 sections that we are reading for week 1. You'll find the book to be a little bit dry at times. It's not the most exciting read. And there's going to be stuff in there that you don't always understand. They're going to be referencing some people or some events, or in some cases technology that you might not be familiar with. I'll clarify some of that stuff in lecture. But also feel free to Google things. Feel free to look stuff up. When you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, just Google it. Don't feel bad. A lot of this stuff is going to be new. So I don't really expect you guys to know a lot of this stuff. So if you feel a little confused, if you feel a little bit lost, you can do some Googling, you can read further, or, of course, you can just reach out to me. But let's just think a little bit about movies for a moment. We're all familiar with movies. I'm hoping that at least most of us or some of us like movies. I'm kind of assuming that we do. Otherwise, why sign up for this class? Even if you don't watch a ton of movies. Maybe there's some that you really like. Maybe you're just kind of interested in, the art form. But I want us to think about movies the way we understand them today. This is a good sort of thought exercise to get started. So we've all seen movies, and we know what movies look like and how movies function today in the year 2025. But we're going to have to adjust our thinking a little bit as we start getting into the movies that we watch in this class. So typically, most Americans, most modern people think of movies first and foremost as entertainment. And that's fine. They are entertainment. And we often see them that way and enjoy them that way. Whether you're going to the movie theater with friends on a weekend, or maybe you're watching something at home when you're feeling a little bit lazy, you don't want to do anything else, so you put a movie on. Movies can often be like comfort food for people. We might like particular genres of movies. Some people enjoy comedies. Other people might like action movies, maybe superhero movies, whatever. Horror is also a popular genre. So we have different reasons for liking the movies that we like, but typically we associate movies with free time. When we have some leisure, when we have some time to ourselves, maybe we put on a movie. Maybe we go and watch a movie. But we're often watching movies at times where we're not necessarily working. We're not at work. So we might not view movies as something that can constitute work. But that's how I want us to adjust our perspective a little bit. Movies will always be entertainment, right? And hopefully some of these movies that we watch this semester will entertain you. Hopefully they will be fun on some level. But I also want us to think about movies as art. In addition to being entertainment, movies can also constitute an art form. And many different people work on movies. Professionals, writers, camera people, the people that do the lighting, the people that do the makeup, the people that do the props, obviously the actors, and also the director who's kind of in charge of a typical movie production. So I want us to kind of remember all of that and keep that in mind. We'll be talking about some of that stuff in lecture. And also, remember that movies, or the study of film, think about the title of this class, film study. Film study is an academic discipline. So I want us to think about that as well. So there are film scholars. There are film professors, people who teach film, both on the production side and the study of film, writing about film, studying and better understanding film, teaching others about film. So at a lot of large universities, you'll have an entire film studies department with their own faculty. People can major in film studies. I was a person who did that when I was an undergrad. So if you think about film study, it's very similar to English in a lot of ways. In English, we are studying texts, right? In a lot of English classes, we are reading literature or other kinds of texts, and then we are analyzing those texts, studying them, writing about them, and ultimately interpreting them, trying to come to a greater understanding. That's pretty much what we do in film study, except now our focus shifts from written texts to the visual medium of motion pictures, movies. But the basic practice, a lot of the basic principles governing what we do are very similar to what we would do in an English class, except now instead of a novel, we are studying a movie. So just keep that stuff in mind. Movies are many different things. They all at once. That's part of what makes them so interesting, and part of what gives them such a rich history. So yes, they've always been entertainment. They've always been designed for fun and leisure. They've always brought joy to people. But movies are also big business. And we're going to learn a lot more about the business side of movies. You know, we all understand Hollywood, kind of what that represents. That's the American film industry. Hollywood has really sort of become a shorthand for all of American movies, or at least the American film industry, as it has functioned for almost 100 years now. But you probably know that other countries also make a lot of movies, so they have their own national film industries. So it's big business. There's a lot of money to be made. So that's important to keep in mind. And then at the same time, like I said, movies are also art. They can also be regarded as an art form. And sometimes there's a distinction made between movies that are really geared towards being art versus movies that are more geared towards entertainment. Some film critics and scholars will say that distinction matters. Others will say that distinction doesn't have to matter, and maybe it's not as strong as it used to be. So we'll explore that idea as well. But before we get moving, it's always good to just sort of think of some movies that you like, think about genres that you like, think about certain characteristics or techniques in movies that you enjoy. And you might not have a name for a lot of them, but you know what you like. You probably like certain kinds of plots or certain types of characters. You might like movies that have a fast pace. A lot's happening. There's a lot of action or adventure. Conversely, you might like funny movies or romantic movies, right? Those are certain traits or characteristics that you might enjoy personally. So keep in mind what you like, because that's going to, kind of shape your experiences as a viewer, and it will shape your interpretations of the movies that we watch. One more thing I'll mention about Canvas in our week 1 module before we get into this week's reading is I've posted a document called Film Study Glossary. Okay, that's only going to be on the week 1 module. I'm not going to keep reposting it, but these modules don't go away. So the week 1 module will be available all semester, which means that glossary of film terms will also be available. I kind of wish our book would have done this, but they don't. So I thought it might be helpful to provide just some basic definitions of a lot of important terminology that goes along with movies. The making of movies, but also just the general understanding of movies. So take a look at that glossary. I will return to it frequently, and I'll be using a lot of the language that you find in that glossary. Sometimes I'll try to explain some of those terms a little bit more during lecture. In other cases, they're kind of self-explanatory, and I'll just assume that you guys have looked over that document and are pretty comfortable with most of the information found there. Again, you'll notice that there's lots of different jobs. There's lots of different people working on movies. And we have to talk about a lot of those people. So we're going to talk about directors and writers and cinematographers and actors. They're all involved. They all have important roles, different roles, within the making of a movie. We might also talk about producers, screenwriters, we might talk about lighting, sound, special effects, editing. There's lots of different levels when it comes to the making of a movie. We need to get comfortable with at least some of that language. And another thing I talk about in the glossary is you need to kind of understand the different levels of film production. there's pre-production, there's the actual shooting of the movie, and then there's post-production, the stuff that gets done after the filming has occurred. So we're going to talk about those different stages, those different levels. We're also going to talk about some of the different parts of like the business side of movies. So there's always production, but what comes after production will be called usually distribution. That's how the film gets sold. And then there's always exhibition. That's how the film gets shown to a paying audience. Now, we know already that the methods of exhibition have changed a lot in recent years. There's lots of studies about this, lots of articles about this if you're interested, but it's interesting to note that nowadays most people watch movies at home on their phones or their other electronic devices. But you guys know that's kind of a new development. For almost a century, the primary way that people watch movies was at the movie theater. Now, eventually we had TV. That was another way to watch movies. But for a long time, exhibition was really just going to a movie theater. That was kind of the only show in town. Then we started watching movies on TV. Like around, the 50s, 60s. Then by the 1980s, we had home video. We could go to a video rental store, bring home a VHS, and watch the movie at home. That was revolutionary. And then after VHS, we had DVDs. If you're as old as me, you can remember watching DVDs from Blockbuster at home. That was one of our primary ways of watching movies. And now, in the modern day, we have all of these streaming options. So exhibition has changed a lot. But the actual production of movies and the distribution, those have changed some, but they're a lot similar. They're still pretty similar to how they've always worked. So we're going to talk about those different levels, those different stages of a movie's life. It has to get made, it has to get distributed, and then eventually it has to get exhibited, either in a theater or streaming on one of your, devices at home. So take a look at the glossary. Again, you don't have to do it right away here at the beginning of week 1, but just remember that you're kind of responsible for the language in that document. I want you guys to be familiar with a lot of those terms and concepts. And you can always do more reading. I'm stealing a lot of this stuff from textbooks and film websites. So if you're interested in a particular area, and I'm not giving you enough in the glossary, you can always read more about it if you have time. Okay, so let's start with origins and survival. Again, we are beginning at the very beginning, the very start of motion pictures. So this will be new, weird, and hopefully at least a little bit interesting. So as the book tells you, there's no one single event or like a big bang type of thing that inaugurates the birth of motion pictures or cinema. There's no one event. There were a lot of events, a lot of breakthroughs, a lot of technological breakthroughs near the end of the 19th century. So that means the 1800s, right? A lot of stuff is happening. There are a lot of big events taking place kind of simultaneously that help to create this new art form. And one of the big developments that we're going to learn about today did happen here in the U.S., courtesy of Thomas Edison, a pretty famous inventor. Most of us have at least heard of him, read about him. Well, in addition to all the other things he invented, he also created this thing called the kinetoscope, which came out around 1891. And that's an important development. Also in France, a few years later, you have these guys, the Lumiere brothers. Two brothers who really helped to pioneer the exhibition of movies. See, that was the big thing that Edison couldn't figure out and other early movie pioneers couldn't figure out. They could film stuff, but they didn't have a way to exhibit the movie to a large audience until the Lumieres came along a little bit later in the 1890s. So we'll talk about all of that stuff a little bit more here in a moment. But just remember, you need to keep in mind what a fertile time the late 1800s were. A lot of people would argue that this is kind of the making of the modern world that we enjoy today. There were a lot of new technologies emerging late in the 19th century, including cars, telephones, the radio. All of that was invented and developed between the 1870s and the 1890s. And movies really come along in the 1890s. So a lot's happening. A lot of breakthroughs, a lot of new technology. The world is changing pretty rapidly. But the book also mentions that there's some earlier technologies that help to contribute to the development of movies. A big one is photography. That's another big sort of technological development that happens in the 19th century, a little bit earlier. We have photography really starting around like the middle of the 1800s. And by the end of the 1800s, picture-taking technology had advanced pretty far. So that's another thing that helps to kind of lead into movies. Obviously, the cameras used to take still photos are different than movie cameras, but not totally different. You know, that was an important sort of predecessor of the movie. Also, they talk about this technology called the magic lantern. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. You can Google the term and maybe learn more about it, but they do discuss it a little bit in the book. It was an early type of image projector. And magic lanterns, I think, were around maybe even as early as the 16 and 1700s. It's really kind of an older technology. It was certainly around throughout the 19th century. And it was a way to project images on a screen or like on a blank wall for an audience to enjoy. But typically the images that they were projecting were like paintings, still images, paintings or photographs or prints. In some cases, these would be plates, like transparent plates made of glass. And they would be held under a lantern or like a light source, and that would allow it to be projected up on the screen. But what makes this different than movies is that the images were not moving, right? You guys know motion picture. Motion is a big part of what makes movies different from these other visual art forms. So the magic lantern didn't really have motion, but it was projected up on a screen, much like movies would be later on. And see, the book also points out that a lot of these technologies overlap. So it's not really a linear progression from like photographs to magic lantern to movies to later TV and VHS and DVD. It doesn't really work like that. There's overlap. Some technologies were still popular, like some older technologies were still popular even as new stuff was getting developed. So as they say in the book, like magic lanterns continued to be popular up until the early 20th century, even after movies had really been invented. And we think of TV as coming along much later, but they were actually doing experiments with electronic image making and transmitting images on like TVs, TV-like devices, not quite a modern TV, but they were doing that stuff as early as the 1880s. So there's overlap, it's not always linear, but just remember that at the end of the 19th century, there's this big explosion of new technologies, and movies are just one of many. So a really important concept that they spend some time on in the book, and I want you guys to understand what this means, because again, it's part of what makes movies sort of distinctive and unique, is this idea called the persistence of vision. So this is basically an illusion, an optical illusion. And that was especially true with early movies. So you get this illusion of continuous movement. And you create that illusion by passing a series of individual images rapidly, one after another, in front of a light source that enables those images then to be projected up on a screen. And this is still basically how film projectors work. Like if you ever go to a movie theater and you're sitting maybe near the back, you might be able to look up and see the little projector area, and you might even see the light coming out of there. Of course, we've advanced a long way, but the principle, the concept remains the same. So the idea is each individual image gets held in front of the light, and then it gets replaced by the next image. So again, if you actually see how film gets threaded through a projector, it really is just one image at a time getting exposed to the light. But as technology advances, the transition from one image to the next became faster and faster and smoother. So when that transition from image to image is fast enough, smooth enough, and the images are similar enough to each other, what we get is this illusion of movement. The persistence of vision makes us think that what we're seeing actually is moving. There actually is motion, when in reality it's not quite like that, but it looks like that. And our brain kind of gets fooled into thinking that we are seeing continuous movement, continuous motion, even though we're not. But again, we take this for granted now, but just imagine how wild this was to people back in the 1890s, right? They had never seen anything like that. They had other devices that would show them images, but it's this movement. It's the persistence of vision that really distinguished movies and made them so new and exciting when they first came onto the scene. So, like I mentioned, the kinetoscope, that was the big invention by Edison at the beginning of the 1890s. But if you ever look at a picture, and again, you can Google this stuff and maybe read more about it online, the kinetoscope was interesting. We call it today like sort of a peep show device. I know that has negative connotations. The subject matter was not offensive, usually. That would sort of come later. But the idea was you could film you could have a movie, but the only way to watch it was for one individual to put their eyes up against the screen, and only one person could watch at once. So the kinetoscope was a peep show device through which short films could be watched by one person at a time. The technology was kind of primitive compared to what we have now, but it worked pretty well for that time. You had this long strip of film, like 40 to 50 feet long, and it ran continuously between an electronic lamp or an electric lamp and a small shutter. And the light source was kind of controlled by the position of the viewer's body and the fact that they were looking directly into the device. So you got the illusion of movement, even though none of the individual images on that film strip were really getting stably shown in front of the light source. It just seemed like they were, as long as just one person was watching. So the optical illusion would only work for one viewer at a time, and there was no way to project the movie onto a bigger screen for a whole, big audience to watch. So that's what limited Edison and the kinetoscope. It would be a popular attraction at like fairs and other places where individuals could take turns watching these little short films. And in fact, some old-timey like arcades and, even some museums will still have kinetoscopes or very similar peep show type devices. They still exist. But that's kind of the best we could do as far as movies were concerned in the early 1890s. Edison could never crack the code on how to project it to a wider paying audience. That breakthrough would happen in France a few years later. The Lumiere brothers. We're going to check out some of their films this week. They created something called the cinematograph. Kind of hard to say. The cinematograph. A new machine that doubled as both a camera, so it was the camera they would actually film the movie with, and it could serve as a projector. Okay, it could actually project the movie onto a screen. That was the breakthrough. So it did this with again, kind of primitive by our standards today, but there was this metal claw within the machine that would pull the film strip frame by frame in front of the gate. And then once it reached that point, that image would be held in front of a light, and then you would move on to the next image, but the claw could move the film strip fast enough to where that illusion of movement was created. But you'll notice, when you're watching not only the Lumiere brothers films, but some of the other early films that I've put in the week 1 module, this is a really herky-jerky movement, because this claw was just kind of pulling the film strip roughly into this gate. So whenever we kind of go from one image to the next, it's a rough cut. It's a herky-jerky, sort of rough transition. But for these really short films, that was okay. But within a few years, as we got more ambitious, as we wanted to tell longer, more detailed stories, the technology had to improve and advance. So later in the 1890s, these British guys helped to create something that I think you still find in projectors today called the Maltese cross. I can't explain it very well. I think you would need a visual. But basically they invented this sort of loop in the film, which allowed it to be pulled through more smoothly. And it made the cuts between images a lot smoother, a lot less noticeable. And this basic practice is still used today for the projection of most standard 35 millimeter film. So if you want to read a little bit more about it, look on page 7 of the book. They give you a pretty good overview of what the Maltese cross is, but you might also want to look at some pictures online. But that was a better way of creating that illusion of movement, that persistence of vision, so that viewers think everything is continuous when in reality it's not. So over the course of the semester, we'll talk a little bit more about stuff like film stock, formats, color, sound. And as they mentioned in the book, in these early days, in the 1890s, a lot of this stuff was pretty wild. There was a lot of new inventions, a lot of innovation, and everything was sort of happening fast. There wasn't a lot of standardization. And that's something we'll talk about more in the weeks to come. Like, movies were so new in the 1890s that we didn't really always know what we were doing. We were still developing a sort of unique vocabulary for movies. We were developing techniques, strategies, technology, and all of this is happening pretty rapidly. But in these early days, it's like the Wild West. There's lots of weird stuff going on, and nothing's really standardized. Nothing is really well established or set in stone. And that also applies to the business model of movies. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the weeks to come, but there really was no established business model yet at this early stage of cinematic history. So the distribution process in particular was very, very strange. The way movies got bought and sold and distributed to different exhibitors, it was chaotic. Different movies in some cases had different endings, filmed for different audiences. And you got to remember, in these early silent movie days, it was actually easier to export movies from one country to the next because there weren't the same language barriers that we would find later with the advent of sound. So silent movies were getting exported all over. Sometimes they would have different endings. Sometimes you would have different intertitles. That's like the text that would appear in silent movies because you couldn't hear what the people were saying. Sometimes you would get dialogue sort of delivered in what we call intertitles, and those would be done in different languages, for different audiences. And also a lot of prints of old films got lost or destroyed because there was no real effort to preserve movies until like the 1930s. Early on, movies weren't quite thought of as art. Not at the very beginning. They were viewed as a novelty. The book mentions this idea, the cinema of attractions. This idea that early movies, they didn't really have plots. They weren't really telling stories. They're often very short. They're just showing normal everyday stuff, and the thrill for audiences was just being able to watch that stuff up on a big screen. They had never experienced that before. But because it was so novel, we didn't really have stories. It wasn't considered an art form on the same level as like painting or novels or even plays. Another predecessor of movies that you have to keep in mind is theater, right? Stage plays, which of course they've been around since ancient times. But movies also borrowed certain techniques and strategies from stage plays because they do have some stuff in common, especially early movies. But early cinema was not thought to be the equal of theater or literature or more traditional visual art or stuff like dance, opera, other art forms. It was strictly sort of a novelty in these early years. So as a result, a lot of old films, you just can't find them anymore. They no longer exist. That makes the study of really old movies a little bit tricky because, again, we lost so much before the 30s, and we finally started preserving a lot of these film prints so we could watch them later. So moving on to early cinema, let's get a little bit more specific about chronology and time periods. So in our second section of chapter 1, early cinema, they kind of break down these early days into 3 different periods. So the first period usually gets started around 1895 because that's when the Lumiere brothers first project their movies up on a big screen in Paris for a paying audience. Big deal. Now, some historians dispute that, and they say there actually might have been some exhibition of movies prior to that, but if so, we just don't really know for sure. The one that's documented that we can point to is 1895 in Paris, and they were watching the same movies that I've posted from the Lumiere brothers. So you'll notice that these aren't movies the way that we think of movies. The Lumiere brothers were filming people leaving work. That's one of their movies that you'll see. They're filming a gardener watering his plants, and then a kid comes up and plays a prank on him, and then he spanks the kid, and the kid runs off. Like, that's the movie. These are very short movies, right? Short films. There's another one of parents feeding their baby. Like, really, like, everyday, typical, sort of mundane events. That's largely what the Lumiere brothers were doing, but it was a breakthrough because they could exhibit it. They had not only mastered filming the movie, but also getting it projected up on the big screen. One of their most famous films, you'll also see this one, is The Arrival of a Train at a train station in France. And the way they set up the camera, you'll see this, they set it up to where the train is coming directly at the camera. And legend has it, I don't know if this is true, but the stories that have been circulated for years is that in that first exhibition, that first viewing of that movie, people in the audience were so frightened. They had never seen a movie before. They were so frightened, they thought the train was literally coming for them. Like they got up from their seat and ran out because they thought the train was going to hit them. That might not be true, but people were certainly taken aback. They were kind of alarmed because they had just never seen movement like that. The persistence of vision, that illusion of movement, was fundamentally different than looking at photographs or looking at a magic lantern. It was even a little bit different than going to the old kinetoscope and watching it through a little peephole. Right? It was a totally different viewing experience. So that begins around 1895. And these earliest films usually only consisted of a single shot. So I'm going to use that phrase, that term a lot, and I've also put it in the glossary. For us, a camera shot is like the most basic element of a film. So again, to kind of compare this to how we might study a text, if we study an individual shot of a movie, that's like studying an individual word or sentence of a novel, right? That's like one of the most basic building blocks of that particular work of art. So a camera shot is a series of frames that are shot uninterrupted from the moment the camera starts rolling until it stops. So this is kind of the basic unit by which movies get shot, right? They are shot by shot. And I've included a few pieces of info about different kinds of shots that you can recognize when you're watching a movie. So there's like a long shot that might start a movie. Like when you're first getting going, you might get a big aerial long shot of like a field or a city where you can see a lot of things. Your perspective is kind of far away from the stuff that you are viewing. And then there's a medium shot. Those are often used when you see people. Right? So when you first see a character walk on screen, you might have a medium shot, which is like the waist up, or you might be able to see most of their body. You're not super close, but you're also not super far away. And then there's the close-up, where you zoom in and you're really close, maybe to somebody's face, or you have a close-up of an object or some other image. Right? So those are different kinds of shots. And typically, we don't even really notice the transition from one shot to the next because in modern movies, it's so smooth. It's so quick. Most shots in modern movies only last for a few seconds. If you actually, can pause and stop and time some of these shots, you'll notice that a typical shot in a modern film might only last for like 2 or 3 seconds. And then we're on to the next thing. But these early movies, they're usually just one single shot. That's how the Lumiere brothers usually did it. They would set up their camera, they would start it, kind of like today, hitting the record button. It was a little more complicated back then, but they would start it, and then they would film whatever they were filming. The kids, the people walking, the train arriving, and then they would stop, and that's the movie. Right? No camera movement, no cutting between different images, at least not in their earliest films. They would progress a little bit in that factory movie you see where there's like a bunch of people leaving work at some factory. I think we do get a few cuts and a few different shots, but they're all kind of set up the same way. Most shots back then were kind of from a long view, kind of a wide perspective, so audiences could see everything. But typically just a single shot, maybe lasting about a minute or a couple of minutes, and that was it. So that's what you'll notice with those early Lumiere Brother films. Also, Rough Sea at Dover, which debuted in New York in 1896. It was filmed in 1895, but not shown until the following year. Again, same thing, right? That was a British production, but the British guys just set their camera up. They filmed the waves hitting the shore for about a minute, and then they stopped, and that's the movie. Right? So very primitive, very simple, no narrative, no real plot. I mean, I guess some of the Lumiere brothers' little short films have a little bit of a story, like the kid playing the prank on the gardener, or there's a couple of old men playing cards, they get a drink, they toast each other. So just really rudimentary, simple, short. That's it. That's the first phase. That's the first era. And that really begins, like I said, around 1895. And that's how movies are for about 6, 7, or 8 years. But once we cross over into the 1900s, around 1902, 1903, we start to get slightly longer movies. And the movies start to tell actual stories. So we have a couple of examples of those in this week's module. So we have Voyage to the Moon. That's a French film by Georges Méliès. Very famous. It's really one of the first well-known narrative movies. It's a fictional narrative. Many people consider it one of the first science fiction movies. It is about a literal trip to the moon. There's Martians, there's all kinds of action. It's very primitive. It's going to be a little bit comical, I think, to a modern viewer. But check it out. You're going to notice that some of the imagery from that movie still shows up in our popular culture in various ways. You might even notice behind me there's a picture on the wall which is actually sort of like the title, title screen of the film. I am a fan, and it's just a famous image. The moon with like the thing sticking in his eye. You see that. You've seen it on album covers. It sometimes shows up in modern film, comics. Like, that movie's really important. It helps to push the medium further. It helps to create more of a sense that movies aren't just for novelty. Movies can also tell stories. Movies can also engage us emotionally. Movies can take us outside of our everyday reality and give us something new and more exciting to think about. So, The Voyage to the Moon comes out in 1902, and again, that's a French film. And then 1 year later, you have The Great Train Robbery, which is an American film, often considered one of the first Westerns. That comes out in 2003, and again, these aren't very long movies. They're around maybe 10, 15 minutes, but they are telling stories. They are longer than those earlier films like Rough Sea at Dover or the stuff from the Lumiere brothers. So we're starting to move forward. And there's some new techniques. There's multiple shots. The camera is starting to move a little bit, though not a lot. And we're starting to get more development, more expertise in this new technology. So eventually Edison gets in on the projecting game, and he comes out in 1896 with the Vitascope. Which he didn't really invent himself, but some, scientists and engineers working for his company came up with it. And that's what they used in 1896 to exhibit several films, including Rough Sea at Dover, in New York. And that's really kind of the dawn of the movie era in the U.S., as we know it today. And again, in these early days, it's the sheer novelty of moving pictures, the cinema of attraction that really got people to come and watch movies. But then once we move into the third phase, so that second period from like 1902 up until like the 19 teens is still early cinema, but we're moving forward. And then we get the transitional period, which really starts around 1910, 1912, and by the teens, we have feature-length, full-length feature films that are making use of a lot of newer cinematic techniques that we'll learn about a little bit more in the weeks to come. So the book calls that transitional cinema. We're kind of transitioning from those primitive early days into a more modern model that we might be able to recognize. So that's the general chronology that I want you guys to kind of keep in mind. And just something as basic as like creating temporal relations or causality. We take this stuff for granted now. But in early cinema, in the really early movies where we just have one long individual shot, the camera doesn't move. You got to remember, the filmmakers aren't trying to create like a fictional reality. They're not trying to create sort of a cause and effect or even like relations between different images necessarily. They're really just getting by on this novelty of the new art form. But once we get up into the 1900s, and you'll see this with the voyage to the moon and the great train robbery, in order to tell those stories, filmmakers realized that they had to create some linkage between individual shots. Right? They had to create what we call temporal relations. Like, they had to simulate the passage of time. And that's something that we don't think about very much as modern viewers, but it was very important in these early days of cinema. So an easy way to think about that is if you're watching a movie and you see a shot, right, one image of a character picking up, they're sitting at their kitchen table, and they have a fork in their hand, and they are looking down at their plate. As a viewer, you would expect in the next shot, right, the next image would be that person taking a bite of food, right? Because you have a sort of cause and effect, a linkage. You expect one shot to logically follow the shot that comes before. Right? We want and expect a logical progression that would recreate how things happen in the real world. Right? So again, we're sort of following basic connections that link us in time and space and cause and effect. But with so again, we see that all the time now. But we have to realize that it was these early films in the very beginning of the 1900s that helped to create that technique and that convention. So Méliès's doing that a little bit, but he doesn't always have a direct cut between individual shots. He was cutting. He really pioneered that editing technique that would allow him to establish links between individual shots. But his did not always match up perfectly. That's what we expect today. It's called a match cut. And a match cut means a cut from one shot to another in which there's a very clear linkage, right? The composition of the shots is very similar. The action, the subject matter is very similar. So again, we're establishing these linkages in time and space. Okay, a person picks up the fork, and then in the next shot, the person is taking a bite of food. That's logical. That makes sense to viewers. But with Méliès and some of these earlier filmmakers, they weren't always doing match cuts. But by the transitional era, by the 19-teens, the 1920s, that kind of editing, that kind of transition from shot to shot had become standard. And pretty much all films did it, but not always. If you're trying to create a sense of unreality, if you want to create dream logic, if you want to unsettle your audiences, you might not always use a match cut. But that became the standard by the transitional period during the 19-teens. And the last thing I'll mention is it's kind of fun to think about in these early days, in the early cinema days, between like 1895 and 1905 or 1910, there really weren't movie theaters yet. Movies were shown at a lot of different places: fairs, carnivals, traveling shows, or even scientific exhibitions. We didn't start getting venues specifically designed for movies until between 1905 and 1910. That was another big step forward as we entered the transitional phase. And eventually, as we might know, movies, as we continue to progress throughout the 20th century, movies would become the dominant mass medium of the 20th century, the dominant art form, perhaps the dominant entertainment form by, say, the middle of the 20th century. But obviously, we're not there yet. So it's going to take a few more decades for that to happen, but just be aware that eventually it will happen. And over the course of that development, movies develop their own conventions, their own language and vocabulary, their own industry, their own business models and business structures, and also, of course, their own exhibition venues, movie theaters. So all of those developments will come along a little bit later. So we'll start covering those next week. So that's it for now. Check out everything in the week 1 module and check out the films. So everything is free this week. The Lumiere brothers, I got you sort of an anthology of all their famous films, so you can watch everything that they've done that we still kind of have today. Also, Rough Sea at Dover is there, Voyage to the Moon is there, and The Great Train Robbery. Some weeks, I'll be able to provide the films for free. Other weeks, you guys are going to have to pay to watch. And I'm sorry about that, but there's just kind of no way around that. But I'll always try to get you an option to rent the film, which will usually only cost maybe $3 or $4. And you can also buy the film if you want to. But I'll always provide those links, and there should usually be a rental option. If you're ever having trouble getting the film or paying for the film, always reach out, let me know, we'll figure it out. But this week, everything's free, everything is linked in the week 1 module. So let me know if you have questions, and otherwise I will see you next week.